The iron glowed white-hot in the forge, and the mountain man's hammer came down with a force that sent sparks scattering across the dirt floor like fallen stars, each strike echoing through the canyon walls where he had built his life alone until the day a woman stumbled into his clearing with blood on her dress and desperation in her eyes. His name was Jacob Thorne, and in the summer of 1872, he had carved out an existence in the Montana Territory that suited him just fine. The nearest town, Silver Creek, lay 15 miles down a treacherous mountain path, far enough that most folks forgot he existed up here among the pines and granite peaks. His cabin sat in a natural clearing beside a cold stream that ran year-round, and his forge occupied a 3-sided structure he had built from riverstone and thick timber. Every morning before the sun cleared the eastern ridges, Jacob stoked his fire and worked the bellows until the coals glowed orange and ready. He made horseshoes mostly, but also hinges, door latches, cooking implements, and occasionally a blade when the request came with enough coin to make the journey worthwhile. Jacob stood 6 feet 4 inches in his worn boots, with shoulders broad enough to block a doorway and arms corded with muscle from years of swinging hammers and working metal. His hair fell past his shoulders in dark waves, usually tied back with a leather cord when he worked, and his beard grew thick and full, though he kept it trimmed close enough to stay out of his way. He had left civilization behind after the war, after watching too many good men die in mud and smoke. And he had found something resembling peace in the rhythm of the forge and the silence of the mountains. That silence shattered on a Tuesday afternoon when he heard a horse screaming. Jacob dropped his hammer and ran toward the sound, his long legs covering the distance to the trail in seconds. A bay mare stood trembling in the path, reins tangled in the underbrush, and on the ground beside her lay a woman in a torn blue dress, one hand pressed to her side where blood seeped between her fingers. Her face had gone pale as milk, but her eyes stayed open and alert, tracking his approach with a mixture of fear and hope. "Easy now," Jacob said, dropping to one knee beside her. "Let me see." "Bandits," she managed, her voice tight with pain. 3 miles back. They shot my father. I ran." Jacob peeled her hand away and examined the wound. The bullet had grazed her ribs, tearing through flesh but missing anything vital. Blood flowed steady but not arterial. She would live if he could get her cleaned up and stop the bleeding. "Can you ride?" he asked. "I do not know. Everything went dizzy and I fell." "I'm going to carry you. My cabin is close." He slid one arm beneath her knees and the other behind her shoulders, lifting her as easily as he might lift a sack of grain. She weighed next to nothing, this slip of a woman who had managed to outrun bandits and make it this far into the wilderness. He grabbed the mare's reins with his free hand and started back toward the clearing, the woman's head falling against his chest as consciousness began to slip. "Stay with me," Jacob said firmly. "What is your name?" "Catherine," she whispered. "Catherine Morrison." "Well, Catherine Morrison, you picked a hell of a day to come visiting. I am Jacob Thorne, and I'm going to make sure you live through this." He carried her into the cabin, laying her on his bed, which dominated one corner of the single large room. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and leather, with pelts hanging on the walls, and his few possessions arranged with military precision on rough-hewn shelves. He had a good supply of clean cloth, whiskey for disinfecting, and enough experience with wounds from his army days to know what needed doing. Catherine drifted in and out as he worked, cleaning the wound with whiskey that made her gasp and bite down on the leather strap he gave her. He stitched the torn flesh with practiced efficiency, his large hands surprisingly gentle and steady. When he finished bandaging her ribs, he covered her with a wool blanket and sat back, watching the color slowly return to her cheeks. She slept through the afternoon and into the evening. Jacob returned to his forge, but he found himself unable to focus on the horseshoe he had been shaping. His mind kept returning to the woman in his bed, to the terror he had seen in her eyes when she mentioned her father, to the way she had trusted him completely when he lifted her into his arms. He knew nothing about her except her name, and the fact that bandits had attacked her family on the mountain road. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Jacob left his forge and walked to the edge of the clearing where wildflowers grew in riotous profusion. Columbines and lupins, Indian paintbrush and wild roses, all blooming in the brief mountain summer. But he had always admired them, but never paid them much attention beyond acknowledging their beauty. Now, for reasons he could not quite name, he found himself gathering an armful of the brightest blooms, selecting each stem with care. When he returned to the cabin, Catherine was awake, propped up against his pillows with the blanket pulled to her chin. Her hair, a rich chestnut brown, had come loose from its pins and hung in tangled waves around her face. She watched him enter with wide hazel eyes that held 1,000 questions. "How do you feel?" Jacob asked, setting the flowers on the table. "Like I was shot," she said, and despite everything, a hint of humor touched her voice. "But alive. Thank you for that. The wound is clean. You will heal if you rest and do not do anything foolish. My father," she said, and the humor vanished. "Those men, they wanted our money. Papa tried to fight them. They shot him. I saw him fall before I ran. I have to go back. I have to know if he—" "Not tonight," Jacob said firmly. "Tonight you heal. Tomorrow, if you are strong enough, I will take you back to where it happened. But moving now will only tear those stitches and put you in danger." Catherine's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. "You do not understand. He might be lying there. He might need help." "I understand more than you think," Jacob said quietly. "But riding into an ambush site in the dark serves no one. If your father survived, he will have made it to town or found help. If he did not, then tomorrow is soon enough to know it." The bluntness of his words made her flinch, but she nodded slowly, recognizing the truth in them. Jacob moved to the fireplace and began preparing a simple meal of beans and salt pork, adding some dried vegetables from his stores. As he cooked, he was acutely aware of her watching him, studying this stranger who had pulled her from the trail and tended her wounds with the efficiency of a field surgeon. "You were in the war," Catherine said. It was not a question. "I was." "Which side?" "The winning side." Jacob stirred the pot without looking at her. "Does it matter now?" "I suppose not. My father fought too. For the Union. He still has nightmares sometimes." Jacob said nothing, but his jaw tightened. He had nightmares too, though he would never speak of them. They ate in relative silence, Catherine managing only a few bites before exhaustion claimed her again. Jacob took the bowls outside to wash in the stream, and when he returned, she had fallen back asleep. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching her breathe, this unexpected intrusion into his carefully constructed solitude. Then he remembered the flowers. He sat in the chair beside the bed, pulling the wildflowers close. His hands, so accustomed to brutal work, to shaping unforgiving metal with hammer and heat, felt clumsy as he separated the stems and began to work. He had seen women braid hair before, had watched his mother do it a lifetime ago, and the principle seemed the same. 3 strands over and under, a pattern emerging from chaos. The work calmed him. The flowers bent to his will, their stems pliant and forgiving. He wove columbines with their purple and white petals, lupins in shades of blue and purple, the bright red of Indian paintbrush providing contrast. By the time he finished, he'd created something beautiful, a crown of flowers that held together through careful braiding and the natural properties of the stems. Catherine stirred as he approached, her eyes opening to find him standing beside the bed with the flower crown in his hands. "What is that?" she asked, her voice thick with sleep. "I thought it might make you feel better," Jacob said, and he felt ridiculous, this mountain of a man holding a circle of wildflowers like some kind of offering. "If you want it," Catherine pushed herself up carefully, wincing at the pull on her stitches. "It is beautiful. Did you make it?" "Just now, while you slept." She reached out, and he placed the crown gently in her hands. She examined it with wonder, her fingers tracing the careful braiding. He used the way he had woven different colors and textures together into a harmonious whole. "I have never seen anything like this," she said softly. "Put it on me?" Jacob hesitated, then reached out and settled the crown on her head, adjusting it until it sat just right among her tangled hair. The flowers brought out the green flecks in her hazel eyes, made her pale skin seem to glow in the firelight. She looked like something out of a fairy story, a woodland princess transported into his rough cabin. "There," he said gruffly, pulling his hands back. "Now rest. We have a hard day ahead tomorrow." Catherine touched the flowers with tentative fingers, and when she looked up at him, Something had shifted in her expression. The fear remained, but it had been joined by curiosity and something else he could not quite name. "Thank you, Jacob Thorne," she said, "for everything." He nodded once and retreated to his chair by the fire, where he sat through the long night, keeping watch while Catherine slept beneath his roof, wearing his flowers like a crown. Morning came cold and clear. Jacob rose before dawn as always, but instead of going immediately to his forge, he checked on Catherine. She had slept through the night without fever, a good sign. The flower crown had fallen to the pillow beside her head, petals already beginning to wilt. She woke when he brought her breakfast, sitting up carefully and accepting the plate of eggs and biscuits he had prepared. "We need to talk about yesterday," Jacob said, settling into the chair. "Tell me everything. Where were you coming from? Where were you going? How many bandits and what did they look like?" Catherine ate slowly, gathering her thoughts. "We were traveling from Bozeman to Silver Creek. My father has a mining claim he wanted to inspect. We hired a guide in Bozeman, a man named Silas Crenshaw. Everything seemed fine until we reached the high pass. That is when 3 men rode out from the rocks. They demanded our money and valuables. Crenshaw, he just rode away, did not even try to help us. My father drew his pistol, but they shot him before he could fire. I saw him fall from his horse. Then I just ran. I did not think. I just kicked my horse and ran as fast as I could. These 3 men, describe them. 2 were rough-looking, unshaven, wearing dusty clothes. But the third, he was different. Well-dressed, almost like a gentleman. He had a scar across his left cheek and cold eyes. He was the one who shot my father." Jacob's jaw tightened. But he knew that description. Cal Brennan, a notorious outlaw who had been terrorizing the Montana Territory for the past 2 years. The law wanted him for robbery and murder, but he was smart and slippery, always staying 1 step ahead of the territorial marshal. "I know him," Jacob said. "Cal Brennan. He runs with a gang of 6 or 7 men. You only saw 3, which means the others might have been scouting ahead or waiting elsewhere." Catherine's face went even paler. "My father. We have to find out what happened to him. Get dressed. I will saddle your mare and my horse. But you need to understand something, Catherine. If we ride back there and your father is still on that trail, the chances are good that he did not survive. Are you prepared for that?" "I have to know," she said simply. "He is my father. I cannot leave him out there." Jacob nodded. He understood duty and loyalty even when they demanded a terrible price. He left her to dress in privacy, taking his time with the horses to give her space. When she emerged from the cabin, she had managed to put herself together despite the pain in her side. The flower crown sat on the table inside, a bright spot of color in his austere home. They rode out as the sun cleared the peaks, taking the trail at a careful pace. Catherine stayed in the saddle despite the obvious discomfort, her face set in grim determination. Jacob kept his rifle across his saddle, eyes scanning the trees and rocks for any sign of ambush. The morning air smelled of pine and the promise of rain, clouds beginning to gather over the high peaks. 3 miles down the trail, they found the site of the attack. There were scorch marks on the rocks where gunfire had chipped stone, blood dried brown on the dirt, and signs of horses moving in multiple directions. But no body, no sign of Catherine's father except the blood and the evidence of violence. Jacob dismounted and studied the ground, reading the story written in tracks and disturbance. "Your father's horse bolted that way," he said, pointing east toward a side trail. "Someone rode after him. Could have been the bandits finishing the job, or could have been him getting away wounded." "Which do you think?" Catherine asked, still mounted, her hands white-knuckled on the reins. "I think your father is tougher than those bastards expected. This much blood would have put most men down, but I see tracks leading away at a gallop. He made it out of here alive." Hope flared in Catherine's eyes. "Then we follow the trail?" "It leads toward Silver Creek. If he made it that far, he would have gotten help. If he did not make it that far, we will find him along the way." They followed the trail for another hour before they heard voices ahead. Jacob raised his hand, stopping Catherine, and he slid from his horse with the rifle ready. But the voices were familiar, the cadence of men on official business rather than outlaws lying in wait. "Hello, the trail!" Jacob called out. "Jacob Thorne coming through." "Thorne, that you?" A man rode into view, wearing a deputy's star pinned to his vest. His name was Pete Rawlins, and he sometimes brought work up to Jacob's forge. Behind him rode 3 other men, one of whom Jacob recognized as Doc Henderson from Silver Creek. "We are looking for a wounded man," Pete said. "Got a report yesterday that bandits hit some travelers up on the high pass. Found a man stumbled into town last night, shot up pretty bad but alive. Says his daughter ran off during the attack. You seen anyone?" "She is right here," Jacob said, and Catherine urged her horse forward. "Papa," she called out, "my father, is he alive?" Doc Henderson tipped his hat. "You must be Catherine Morrison. Your father's alive, miss, though he took a bullet in the shoulder. Lost a lot of blood, but he is stable now. He's been raising hell all morning, demanding we mount a search party to find you." Catherine sagged in her saddle, relief washing over her so strongly that Jacob moved quickly to steady her. "Thank God," she whispered. "Oh, thank God." "We should get you both back to town," Pete said. "Miss Morrison, you look like you could use the doc's attention yourself." "She took a bullet, too," Jacob said. "I stitched her up last night. She needs proper rest and care." The men exchanged glances, and Jacob could read the questions in their eyes. A young woman spending the night in a bachelor's cabin was the sort of thing that started talk, no matter how innocent the circumstances. But Doc Henderson just nodded professionally and said, "Let me take a look at that wound, miss. If Thorne did the stitching, I expect it is solid work. He patched up more than a few soldiers in his time." They made their way to Silver Creek as a group, with Catherine riding beside Jacob. She kept glancing at him, and he could see gratitude and something else in her eyes. The town appeared as they rounded the final bend, and a collection of wooden buildings strung along a single main street with the mountains rising like sentinels on all sides. Catherine's father was staying at the hotel, and when they arrived, he came barreling out the front door despite Doc Henderson's protests, his left arm in a sling and his face gray with pain and worry. "Catherine! My God, Catherine!" She slid from her horse and ran to him, careful of both their wounds, and they embraced with the desperate relief of people who thought they had lost each other forever. Jacob hung back, feeling like an intruder on their reunion, but Catherine pulled away from her father and turned to him. "Papa, this is Jacob Thorne. He saved my life. I would have bled to death on the trail if he had not found me." James Morrison was a man in his early 50s, east with gray threading through his brown hair and the weathered look of someone who had spent years outdoors. He extended his good hand to Jacob. "I owe you a debt I can never repay, Mr. Thorne. Thank you for bringing my daughter back to me." "She is a strong woman," Jacob said simply. "She did most of the work herself. Nevertheless, please come inside. Let me buy you a drink, a meal, anything you need." Jacob wanted to refuse, to retreat back to his mountain and his solitude, but Catherine was looking at him with those hazel eyes, and he found himself nodding. A drink would not go amiss. They settled in the hotel's small dining room, and Catherine told her father everything that had happened. James Morrison's face darkened when she mentioned Silas Crenshaw abandoning them, and again when she described Cal Brennan. "Again, that guide," James growled. "I will see him answer for leaving us to die." "He might have been part of it," Jacob said. "Brennan is known for having men on the inside setting up travelers for ambush. You might want to tell the marshal about Crenshaw." "I already did. Pete Rollins took my statement this morning. They are looking for the whole gang." They talked for another hour, and Jacob learned that James Morrison was indeed inspecting a mining claim, one that had recently shown promising signs of silver. He had brought Catherine with him because she had lost her mother 2 years prior to consumption, and they only had each other now. They lived in Bozeman, where James worked as an assayer and mineral surveyor. "We will need to stay in Silver Creek for at least a week while we heal," James said. "And we will need to arrange new transportation back to Bozeman. I'm not eager to make that trip again without proper guards." "I know some men who run freight and passengers," Jacob offered. "They are reliable and well armed. I can introduce you if you like." "I would appreciate that very much." Doc Henderson insisted on examining both patients again, pronouncing Jacob's stitching adequate though lacking finesse, which made Catherine smile. He rebandaged her ribs and gave strict orders for rest and limited movement. James Morrison's wound was more serious, the bullet having shattered his collarbone before exiting through the back of his shoulder, but the doctor was optimistic about his recovery. As the afternoon wore on, Jacob found himself reluctant to leave. Catherine kept drawing him into conversation, asking about his life on the mountain, his forge work, how long he'd been living alone up there. She was educated and well-spoken, with a curiosity about the world that reminded him of how he had been before the war, before he had retreated into himself. Finally, as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Jacob stood. "I should head back. I have work waiting at the forge." "Will you come back?" Catherine asked quickly. "To visit, I mean. We will be here all week." Jacob hesitated. He could see James Morrison watching the exchange with interest, noting the way his daughter looked at the mountain man. "I might make it down again," Jacob said carefully. "I need to deliver some horseshoes to the livery anyway." "Tomorrow?" Catherine pressed. "Catherine," her father said gently, "Mr. Thorne has his own life and work. We cannot impose." "You are not imposing," Jacob heard himself say. "I will come tomorrow, afternoon probably." The smile that lit Catherine's face made something warm unfurl in his chest, a feeling he had thought long dead. He tipped his hat to both of them and made his escape before he could say anything else foolish. The ride back to his cabin gave him time to think, to wonder what the hell he was doing. He had built his life around solitude, around the simple rhythms of forge and forest. He had no room in that life for a woman, especially not a refined woman from town with education and prospects. Whatever he was feeling, it was just the natural response to having someone in his space, to having saved a life and earned gratitude. It would pass. But when he reached his cabin and saw the flower crown still sitting on his table, wilted but intact, he found himself already thinking about which flowers he would pick tomorrow. The next morning, Jacob woke before dawn as always and went straight to his forge. He had orders to fill, horseshoes that needed shaping and finishing, and the work had piled up during Catherine's unexpected arrival. He stoked the fire hot and began the familiar rhythm of heat and hammer, metal ringing against metal, sparks flying with each strike. But his mind kept wandering. He thought about Catherine's smile, the way she had looked wearing the flower crown, the strength she had shown despite her wound. He thought about her questions, her genuine interest in his solitary life. Most people in Silver Creek treated him with wary respect, acknowledging his skill but keeping their distance from the mountain hermit. Catherine had looked at him like he was just a man, nothing to fear, someone worth knowing. The morning passed in productive labor. By noon, he had completed 4 sets of horseshoes and started work on a set of door hinges someone had ordered. His muscles burned pleasantly, sweat ran down his back, and the forge radiated heat like a small sun. This was his life, the thing that made sense in a world that often did not. But when afternoon arrived, he found himself banking the fire and washing up at the stream, changing into his cleanest shirt and combing the tangles from his long hair. He gathered more wildflowers, an even bigger armful this time, selecting the freshest and most vibrant blooms. Then he saddled his horse and headed down the mountain toward Silver Creek. Catherine was sitting on the hotel's front porch when he arrived, her father beside her. Both looked better than they had yesterday. Color returned to their faces, and some of the tension eased from their shoulders. Catherine's face lit up when she saw him, and she started to stand before remembering the doctor's orders and settling back into her chair with a rueful expression. "Mr. Thorne," James called out, "good to see you again. I was just telling Catherine that you likely had too much work to spare time for idle visits." "Work can wait," Jacob said, dismounting. He held out the flowers, feeling self-conscious under James Morrison's interested gaze. "I brought these. Thought they might brighten up your room." "They are beautiful," Catherine said, accepting them with obvious delight. "Papa, look at all these different varieties. We should put them in water." "I have a better idea," Jacob said. "If you have some time, I could show you how to braid them, the way I did last night. They last longer that way, and you can wear them or hang them up." "You would teach me?" Catherine asked, "if you want to learn." They settled on the porch, James Morrison watching with poorly concealed amusement as Jacob showed his daughter how to separate the stems, how to braid them together, the pattern that created something stronger and more beautiful than the individual flowers alone. Catherine's hands were smaller and more nimble than his, and she picked up the technique quickly, her fingers flying through the work. "You have a talent for this," Jacob observed, "better than me already." "I used to braid my mother's hair every night," Catherine said softly, "before she got sick. This reminds me of that. Thank you for teaching me." They worked together, creating 2 crowns and a long garland that Catherine draped around her shoulders. Other people passed on the street, and Jacob could feel their curious stares, the way they noted him sitting close to Catherine Morrison, their heads bent together over flowers and conversation. Let them talk. He was beyond caring what the town thought of him. James Morrison cleared his throat. "Mr. Thorne, I was wondering if you might join us for dinner this evening. I know it is a long ride back to your place, but I would like to hear more about your work. I have always been fascinated by metallurgy and the properties of different alloys." "Papa is something of a scholar," Catherine said with obvious pride. "He studied geology and chemistry back east before the war." "I would be interested in hearing about your mining claim, too," Jacob said. "I have done some prospecting in my time before I settled into smithing full-time." They spent the evening in the hotel dining room, talking about everything from mineral deposits to forge temperatures to the challenges of surviving Montana winters. James Morrison was indeed well-educated and passionate about his work, and Jacob found himself enjoying the conversation more than he had enjoyed anything in years. Catherine contributed her own observations, revealing a sharp mind and scientific curiosity that her father had clearly encouraged. As the evening wound down, James excused himself, claiming fatigue from his wound. "But you two should stay and talk," he said. "I will be fine upstairs." And Catherine could use the company. Being cooped up in a hotel room is making her restless. After he left, Catherine leaned forward. "My father is not subtle, is he?" "No, he's not," Jacob agreed. "Does it bother you, his pushing us together?" "Should it bother me?" Catherine countered. "You are a good man, Jacob Thorne. You saved my life. You have been nothing but kind and respectful, and you make flower crowns with hands that forge iron. I think my father is a good judge of character." "I am not looking for anything," Jacob said carefully. "I have my life set up the way I want it, alone, quiet, simple. And yet you came back today. You brought flowers. You spent hours with us when you could have been working." Jacob had no answer to that. She was right. He could have stayed on his mountain. He could have let this connection fade into nothing. Instead, he was here, and some part of him he had thought dead was stirring back to life. "Tell me about your life in Bozeman," he said, changing the subject. "What do you do when you are not getting shot by bandits?" Catherine laughed, then winced and pressed a hand to her ribs. "I help my father with his work, mostly. I keep his books, organize his samples, sometimes assist with the chemical analyses. I also teach reading and writing to children twice a week at the church. It is not exciting, but it is a good life." "You never wanted to marry? Have a family of your own?" "I had a suitor once," Catherine said, her voice growing quiet, "before my mother died. A banker's son from back east. Very proper, very boring. He wanted me to give up helping my father and focus on being a wife. When I refused, he found someone more amenable. I have not regretted that choice." "Good," Jacob said firmly. "Any man who would ask you to be less than you are does not deserve you." Catherine looked at him with such warmth that he felt heat rise to his face. "You understand," she said simply. "Most men do not." They talked until the hotel keeper started giving them pointed looks, and then Jacob walked Catherine to the stairs, where they lingered for a moment. "Will you come again tomorrow?" Catherine asked. "I will bring more flowers," Jacob promised, "and maybe I will teach you some other braiding patterns." "I would like that very much." Jacob rode home under a canopy of stars, his mind full of Catherine's laughter and the touch of her hand when she had said good night. He was in dangerous territory now, letting himself care, letting himself imagine possibilities. But as he reached his cabin and looked at the wilted flower crown still on his table, he realized it was too late to turn back. The pattern established itself over the next several days. Jacob would work his forge in the morning, then ride to Silver Creek in the afternoon with fresh flowers. He and Catherine would sit on the hotel porch or take slow walks around town, her strength returning a little more each day, and he would show her different ways to weave the flowers together. They created crowns and garlands, small nosegays, and elaborate braided ropes of blooms. Catherine's hotel room began to look like a garden, every surface decorated with their creations. James Morrison watched their growing connection with approval. On making himself scarce whenever appropriate and engaging Jacob in long conversations about the mining industry when Catherine needed to rest. He never pressured either of them, but his blessing was clear in every interaction. On the fourth day, as Jacob was preparing to leave, Catherine caught his hand. "Will you take me to your cabin tomorrow? I want to see where you work, where you live, if you are comfortable with that." Jacob hesitated. His cabin was his private sanctuary, the place where he had hidden from the world for years. Bringing Catherine there felt like exposing something vulnerable and raw, but he found himself nodding. "If your father approves and you feel strong enough for the ride." "I will get Papa's permission," Catherine said firmly, "and I am strong enough. The wound is healing well." The next morning, Jacob arrived at the hotel to find Catherine dressed in practical riding clothes, her face alight with excitement. James Morrison pulled him aside before they left. "I trust you with my daughter's life and her reputation," James said quietly. "You have proven yourself to be an honorable man. But Jacob, I need to ask your intentions. Catherine is falling in love with you. I can see it in the way she looks at you, talks about you. If you cannot return those feelings, you need to step back now before hearts get broken." Jacob met the older man's eyes. "I have been alone for 8 years, he said. "I thought I would be alone until I died. But your daughter, she makes me want things I gave up on. I do not know if I can be what she needs. I do not know if I can leave my mountain or if she could be happy there. But I am not playing games with her heart. Whatever this is, it matters to me." James studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "That's all I needed to hear. Bring her back before dark." The ride up to Jacob's cabin took 2 hours at an easy pace. Catherine drank in the scenery, pointing out birds and wildflowers, asking questions about the wildlife and the land. Jacob found himself seeing his mountain through her eyes, noticing beauty he had taken for granted, feeling pride in the territory he called home. When they reached the clearing, Catherine gasped. "Jacob, this is beautiful, the way you have set everything up, the forge with the view of the valley, the cabin by the stream. It is perfect." "It suits me," Jacob said. "Come inside." He showed her around the cabin, was suddenly self-conscious about his rough furniture and simple possessions. But Catherine moved through the space with genuine interest, examining his books, the pelts on the walls, the neat organization of his supplies. "You built all this yourself?" she asked. "Over several years. The cabin first, then the forge, adding and improving as I went." Catherine walked to the window that overlooked the clearing. "I can see why you love it here. It is peaceful. Away from everything." "Too far away?" Jacob asked. "For someone used to town life?" Catherine turned to face him. "I have been thinking about that, about what it would mean, living this far from civilization, the isolation, the hard work, the long winters. And Jacob, I need you to understand something. I grew up following my father to remote mining camps and survey sites. I have slept in tents and rough cabins, cooked over open fires, gone weeks without seeing another woman. I am not some delicate flower who needs society and convenience." "I never thought you were," Jacob said, moving closer. "But thinking about visiting remote places and actually living this far from everything are different things." "Are they?" Catherine stepped closer to him, close enough that he could smell the wildflowers she had woven into her hair that morning. "What are you really asking me, Jacob?" "I'm asking if you could be happy here," Jacob said, his voice rough. "With me, living this life, because I cannot leave it, Catherine. This mountain, this forge, this is who I am now." "I do not want you to leave it," Catherine said. "I want you to share it with me." Jacob cupped her face in his large, calloused hands. He searching her eyes for any doubt. Finding none, he lowered his head and kissed her gently, carefully, as if she were made of spun glass. Catherine made a soft sound and pressed closer, her arms coming up around his neck, and the kiss deepened into something that made his heart pound and his breath catch. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Jacob rested his forehead against hers. "I'm falling in love with you," he said. "I did not think I could feel this way again." "Again?" Catherine asked softly. "I was engaged once, before the war. She died of fever while I was away fighting. I thought that was it for me, that I had used up my chance at love. But then you stumbled into my clearing, bleeding and brave, and everything changed." "I'm sorry about your loss," Catherine said. "But Jacob, I'm glad you found me. I am glad you saved me, and I am falling in love with you, too. They spent the rest of the day together at the cabin. Jacob showed Catherine his forge, letting her watch as he worked hot iron, explaining the techniques and the temperatures, the way metal could be shaped and transformed through heat and pressure. She asked intelligent questions and listened with genuine fascination, and he realized that James Morrison had been right about her scientific mind. In the afternoon, they walked to the meadow where Jacob gathered his flowers, and Catherine exclaimed over the variety and abundance, immediately dropping to her knees to examine different species. "This is incredible. I have never seen such a concentration of wildflowers in one place. The soil must be perfect here. The stream floods every spring," Jacob explained. "It deposits minerals and nutrients. I've been thinking about putting in a garden, growing vegetables, but I never got around to it." "We could do it together," Catherine said, then paused. "I mean, if you wanted. If I was here." "I want you here," Jacob said simply. "I want you here every day. But Catherine, I need you to think about this seriously. Talk to your father. Take some time before making any decisions. I am not going anywhere. I will wait as long as you need." "I do not need time," Catherine said. "I know what I want." "Your father might need time," Jacob pointed out, "and we should do this properly. Court you in town, let people see us together, give your father a chance to get used to the idea of you living up here. I do not want to rush you into anything." Catherine smiled. "You are very honorable, Jacob Thorne. It is one of the many things I love about you." They gathered an enormous armful of flowers, and as the afternoon sun began to slant toward evening, Jacob showed Catherine how to create an elaborate braided crown, the most complex pattern he knew. They sat side by side in the meadow, hands working together, and when they finished, the crown was a work of art, a riot of colors woven into an intricate design. Jacob placed it on Catherine's head, adjusting it carefully. "You look like a queen," he said softly, "a mountain queen." "Your queen," Catherine said, and kissed him again. They rode back to Silver Creek as the sun set, arriving just as twilight painted the sky in shades of purple and gold. James Morrison was waiting on the porch, and one look at their faces told him everything he needed to know. "All right, I see you two have reached an understanding," he said dryly. "Papa," Catherine said, dismounting carefully, "Jacob and I need to talk to you." They sat in the hotel dining room over coffee, and Jacob laid out his feelings and intentions with the same straightforwardness he brought to everything. He wanted to marry Catherine, wanted to make a life with her on his mountain, but he understood that James might have concerns, might need time to accept the idea of his only daughter living so remotely. James listened without interrupting, then sat back in his chair. "Mr. Thorne, Jacob, you saved my daughter's life. You have treated her with nothing but respect and kindness. You are clearly a man of skill and intelligence with the ability to provide for a family. But I need to ask you something. Have you considered that Catherine might want children someday? That she might need help during pregnancy and childbirth, help that would be very far away on that mountain of yours?" "I have thought about it," Jacob said, "and I will not lie, it concerns me. But there are women in Silver Creek who work as midwives, and I would make sure Catherine had access to proper care. I would move heaven and earth to keep her safe." "I know you would," James said. "I can see how much you love her, and Catherine has made her own feelings very clear. She wants this, and she is a grown woman capable of making her own decisions. You have my blessing, Jacob, but I want you to promise me something. Anything. Promise me that you will bring her to visit me at least twice a year. Mo, I cannot stand the thought of losing touch with my daughter." "You will never lose touch," Catherine interjected. "Papa, you are welcome at the cabin any time, and we will come to Bozeman regularly. I am not disappearing from your life." "Then I suppose we should start planning a wedding," James said, and smiled despite the tears in his eyes. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of activity. Catherine and James remained in Silver Creek while they healed, and Jacob became a regular fixture in town, courting Catherine properly under the watchful eyes of the community. He met her in the morning and walked her around town, took her to dinners and church socials, sat with her family in the evenings. The townsfolk quickly grew accustomed to seeing the mountain man and the young woman from Bozeman together. And after the initial gossip died down, most people seemed to approve of the match. Jacob continued his forge work, but now Catherine would ride up to the cabin several times a week, sometimes with her father and sometimes with Jacob as escort. She began making changes to the cabin, adding curtains and organizing the kitchen, bringing in supplies and small touches of comfort. Jacob watched his stark bachelor's quarters transform into something that felt like a real home, and he found he did not mind the changes at all. Every evening, without fail, Jacob braided wildflowers into Catherine's hair. It became their ritual, their special time together. He would gather the freshest blooms, and they would sit together while he wove them into increasingly elaborate designs. Catherine wore the flowers like badges of honor. Bees and soon other women in town were asking her to teach them the technique. They were married on a bright morning in late July, in the small church in Silver Creek with half the town in attendance. Catherine wore a simple white dress with wildflowers braided into her hair, and Jacob wore his best clothes with his long hair tied back and his beard freshly trimmed. James Morrison walked his daughter down the aisle with obvious pride, and when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Jacob kissed his bride with a joy he had never thought to feel again. The celebration lasted into the evening, with food and music and dancing in the street. But as the stars came out, Jacob and Catherine slipped away, riding up the mountain trail toward their home. The cabin glowed with lamplight as they approached, and Jacob carried Catherine over the threshold, despite her laughing protests that her wound had long since healed. "We are home," Jacob said, setting her down gently. "We are home," Catherine agreed, and kissed her husband. Their first months of marriage were an adjustment, learning each other's rhythms and habits, figuring out how to share space and make decisions together. Catherine threw herself into improving the cabin and the property, starting the vegetable garden they had discussed, organizing Jacob's chaotic system of supplies and orders, even helping at the forge when he needed an extra pair of hands. Jacob found himself happier than he could have imagined, coming in from the forge each day to find Catherine working in the garden or preparing dinner, seeing her smile when he entered the cabin. The loneliness that had defined his existence for 8 years vanished completely, replaced by the warmth of companionship and love. He continued his ritual of braiding flowers into her hair every evening, no matter how tired he was or how busy the day had been. It was their time sitting together as the sun set, his large hands gentle in her hair, weaving beauty into something that would last until morning. Catherine treasured these moments, often falling asleep in his arms with wildflowers still woven through her brown hair. As summer turned to fall, the wildflowers began to die back, but Jacob found ways to continue the tradition. He dried flowers and grasses, learned to work with pine boughs and the red berries of mountain ash, adapted his braiding techniques to whatever materials the season provided. Catherine's hair became a canvas for his creativity, adorned with the changing seasons. Winter came hard to the Montana mountains that year. Snow fell in October and did not melt until April, and temperatures dropped low enough to freeze the stream solid. But Jacob had prepared well, with a cabin stocked full of supplies and enough firewood to last twice as long as they would need it. He worked in his forge when the weather allowed, crafting items for spring delivery, and spent the long evenings with Catherine, reading by firelight or talking about their plans for the future. It was in February, during a brief warm spell, that Catherine made her announcement. They were sitting by the fire after dinner, and she reached for his hand, placing it on her stomach. "Jacob," she said softly, "we are going to have a baby." Jacob froze, a joy and terror flooding through him in equal measure. "Are you certain?" "I am certain. Doc Henderson confirmed it when we went to town last week. I wanted to be sure before I told you. We will have a child by late summer." Jacob pulled her into his arms, holding her carefully, his mind racing. A child. His child. Their child. All his concerns about Catherine being so far from help during pregnancy came roaring back, but she must have felt him tense because she pushed back to look into his face. "I am healthy and strong," Catherine said firmly. "Women have been having babies in remote places since the beginning of time. We will be fine, Jacob. I promise." "I'm going to worry every single day," Jacob admitted. "But Catherine, I'm also happier than I've ever been. A baby. Our baby." They spent the rest of the winter preparing, turning the small alcove off the main room into a nursery, building a cradle from pine wood that Jacob sanded until it was smooth as glass. Catherine sewed blankets and tiny clothes, and James Morrison visited twice, bringing supplies and gifts, his own excitement at becoming a grandfather obvious in every word and gesture. Spring brought the return of the wildflowers, and Jacob resumed his evening ritual with renewed dedication. Catherine's body changed as the baby grew, and Jacob marveled at the miracle of it, at the life they had created together. He became fiercely protective, insisting she avoid any heavy work, hovering whenever she moved around the cabin or worked in the garden. "I am pregnant, not made of glass," Catherine would remind him with exasperation, but she was also clearly touched by his concern. "Baptiseur." As summer approached and Catherine's time drew near, Jacob made arrangements for Doc Henderson to stay at the cabin for the final 2 weeks. He also convinced James Morrison to come and bring a midwife from Bozeman, a woman with 30 years of experience who had delivered more babies than anyone in the territory. Their son was born on a hot August afternoon, after a labor that lasted 12 hours, and left Jacob pacing outside the cabin like a caged animal, listening to Catherine's cries and feeling utterly helpless. But when Doc Henderson finally called him inside and placed the tiny, squalling bundle in his arms, every moment of fear and worry evaporated in the face of overwhelming love. "He is perfect," Jacob whispered, staring down at his son's red face and tiny fists. "Catherine, he is perfect." Catherine, exhausted and radiant, he smiled from the bed. "He has your nose," she said. "Poor child." They named him Daniel, after Jacob's father, and he proved to be a healthy, strong baby with an impressive set of lungs. Jacob discovered depths of tenderness in himself he had not known existed, sitting up through the night rocking his son while Catherine slept, singing half-remembered songs from his own childhood, promising this tiny person that he would always be protected and loved. James Morrison stayed for 2 weeks, helping out and marveling at his grandson, and before he left, he pulled Jacob aside. "You have given me a son," James said, his voice thick with emotion, "and now a grandson. Thank you for making my daughter so happy." "She made me happy first," Jacob said simply. "The years that followed were full and rich. Daniel grew into a curious, adventurous boy who loved following his father to the forge and helping his mother in the garden. Jacob taught his son about working metal and reading the mountains, about tracking animals and respecting the land. Catherine taught Daniel to read and write, to identify plants and understand the natural world, to be kind and thoughtful. When Daniel was 3, Catherine became pregnant again, and this time she delivered a daughter they named Rose, after the wild roses that grew so abundantly in their meadow. Rose had her mother's hazel eyes and her father's stubborn determination, and from the moment she could walk, she was constantly escaping to explore, giving her parents heart attacks on a regular basis. Every evening, no matter how chaotic the day had been with 2 young children, Jacob still braided wildflowers into Catherine's hair. It was their sacred time, when the children were in bed and the cabin was quiet, when they could reconnect and remember why they had fallen in love in that first chaotic week when she had stumbled into his life bleeding and desperate. "I never thanked those bandits," Catherine said one evening as Jacob wove columbines through her hair. "If they had not attacked us, I never would have found you." "Do not thank them," Jacob said firmly. "They shot your father and nearly killed you. But I understand what you mean. Strange how the worst moments can lead to the best things." "Do you ever miss it?" Catherine asked. "Your solitary life before I complicated everything?" Jacob set down the flowers and turned her to face him. "Not for 1 second," he said. "You did not complicate my life, Catherine. You gave me a life worth living. You, and Daniel, Rose, all of this. It is everything I never knew I needed." When Daniel was 8 and Rose was 5, they had another addition to the family, twin boys they named Thomas and James after Catherine's father. The cabin was expanded to accommodate the growing family, with Jacob adding an entire second room and a larger kitchen. The forge work remained steady, and Jacob had built a reputation as one of the finest blacksmiths in the territory, with orders coming from as far away as Helena and Butte. Catherine managed the business side of things, keeping the books and handling correspondence, teaching all 4 children at home, and still finding time to work in her now extensive garden. She and Jacob had developed a system over the years, a partnership that played to both their strengths, and their home was filled with laughter and love. James Morrison visited regularly, staying for weeks at a time, spoiling his grandchildren and engaging in long discussions with Jacob about mining and metallurgy. He had retired from active surveying, but still consulted on mineral claims, and he often brought interesting samples for Jacob to analyze and work with. The wildflower braiding ritual continued, adapted as needed. Sometimes it was rushed, a quick weaving of a few stems when the children demanded attention. Sometimes it was elaborate, taking an hour of careful work while they talked about their day and their plans. Sometimes the children would watch, fascinated by their father's gentle hands creating beauty, and they would beg to help or to have flowers braided into their own hair. Jacob taught Daniel how to braid flowers, and Daniel taught Rose, and soon all the Thorne children were wearing crowns and garlands of wildflowers, running through the meadow like fairy tale creatures. Catherine would watch them from the cabin porch, Jacob's arm around her shoulders, and marvel at the life they had built together. "Who would have thought," she said one evening as the sun set over the mountains and their children played in the clearing, "that the rough mountain man who saved my life would turn out to be such a romantic." "I am not a romantic," Jacob protested. "I just appreciate beauty when I see it. You braid flowers into my hair every single evening, Jacob. That is the definition of romantic." "Well, maybe a little," he conceded, and kissed the top of her head, careful not to disturb the crown of lupins and Indian paintbrush he had just finished weaving. The years turned into decades. The children grew and eventually left home one by one to make their own lives, though none of them went far. Daniel became a blacksmith like his father, setting up his own forge in Silver Creek and marrying a girl from town. Rose shocked everyone by becoming a mineral surveyor like her grandfather, one of the few women working in that field, and she partnered with a young geologist who respected her skills and intelligence. Thomas and James went into ranching together, buying land on the eastern side of the mountains and building a successful cattle operation. Jacob and Catherine remained on their mountain, though they visited their children regularly, and welcomed a steady stream of grandchildren who loved coming to stay at the cabin where their father or mother had grown up. The forge still rang with the sound of hammer on iron, though Jacob had slowed down some, no longer working from dawn to dusk, but taking more time to enjoy the mountains and the life he had built. And every single evening, without fail, unless one of them was sick or away visiting family, Jacob braided wildflowers into Catherine's hair. Her hair had turned gray over the years, but that only made the flowers stand out more vividly, bright colors woven through silver. She teased him that he was more obsessed with the ritual now than he had been when they first married, and he did not deny it. "It reminds me," he said one evening when they were both in their 60s, his hands still steady as he wove a delicate crown of late summer blooms, "of that first night. When you were lying in my bed, wounded and scared, and I did not know what to say or how to help, so I made you a crown of flowers, and you looked at me like I had given you something precious." "You did give me something precious," Catherine said softly. "You gave me hope. You gave me love. You gave me this life." "We gave each other this life," Jacob corrected. They sat on the porch as the sun set, Catherine leaning against Jacob's shoulder, both of them watching the light fade from the sky and the first stars appear. The mountain was quiet except for the sound of the stream and the wind in the pines, the same sounds that had been there when Jacob first arrived all those years ago, young and broken and sure he would live out his days alone. "Do you remember," Catherine said, "when you told me you were falling in love with me? That day at the cabin when I first saw this place?" "I remember every moment of that day," Jacob said. "I remember being terrified that you would say no, that you would realize what you were giving up to be with me." "I gave up nothing," Catherine said firmly. "I gained everything. A husband who loves me, children and grandchildren, a home in the most beautiful place on earth, and a man who has braided flowers into my hair every single evening for 43 years. What could I possibly regret?" "Nothing, I hope," Jacob said, kissing her temple, "because I have no regrets at all, not one." They sat in comfortable silence as the darkness deepened and the stars multiplied across the vast Montana sky. Inside the cabin, lamps glowed warm and welcoming, and the fire crackled on the hearth. Tomorrow Jacob would rise before dawn and work his forge, heating iron and shaping metal with the same skill he had honed over 5 decades. Tomorrow Catherine would work in her garden and write letters to their children and grandchildren, maintaining the web of family connections that had grown so vast and complex. But tonight, they were simply Jacob and Catherine, Mountain Man, and the woman who had stumbled into his clearing with blood on her dress and desperation in her eyes, two people who had found in each other the missing pieces of their souls. "Come inside," Catherine said eventually, standing and offering her hand. "It is getting cold." Jacob took her hand, this woman he had loved for more than 4 decades, and followed her into the warmth of their home. The flower crown still sat in her hair, a testament to his devotion and her beauty, to the ritual that had defined their relationship from the very beginning. In the years that followed, Jacob and Catherine continued their peaceful existence on the mountain. Jacob finally stopped taking commission work when he turned 70, deciding that 50 years of blacksmithing was enough. But he still kept the forge warm and worked iron when the mood struck him, creating decorative pieces for their grandchildren or repairing tools for the neighbors who still made the trek up the mountain to visit. Catherine's garden became legendary in the region, with people traveling from Silver Creek and beyond to see the vegetables and flowers that somehow thrived in the high mountain soil. She shared her knowledge freely, was teaching young mothers how to grow food and preserve it for the long winters, passing on skills that could mean the difference between comfort and hardship in the harsh territory. Their children and grandchildren visited often, filling the cabin with noise and laughter, and Jacob and Catherine reveled in the chaos. They had added onto the cabin so many times over the years that it now sprawled across the clearing with multiple bedrooms and a large common room where the whole family could gather. But through everything, through aging bodies and changing times, through grandchildren growing into adults and starting families of their own, the evening ritual remained constant. Jacob gathered wildflowers every day from the meadow that had become a protected sanctuary. And every evening he braided them into Catherine's silver hair with hands that trembled slightly now, but remained gentle and sure. "How many flowers have you braided into my hair over the years?" Catherine asked one evening when they were both in their mid-70s. Jacob considered. "Well, 48 years of marriage, 365 days a year, minus maybe 100 days total when one of us was sick or away. That is more than 17,000 times." 17,000 flower crowns, Catherine marveled. "You must know every wildflower in this meadow by heart." "I know them all," Jacob confirmed, "but I never get tired of them, just like I never get tired of you." "Flatterer," Catherine said, but she was smiling. James Morrison had passed away peacefully 5 years earlier at the age of 91. Surrounded by his family in the Bozeman home, he had shared with a housekeeper who had become his companion in his later years. His loss had hit Catherine hard, but she took comfort in knowing that he had lived a full life and had been able to see his grandchildren and great-grandchildren flourish. On a crisp autumn morning in their 76th year, Catherine woke feeling unusually tired. She insisted she was fine, just needing to rest, but by evening she had developed a fever. Jacob sent for Doc Henderson's successor, a young doctor named Williams who had studied back east and returned to serve the mountain communities. "Her heart is weak," Dr. Williams said after examining Catherine. "It has been working too hard for too long. I can give her medicine to help, but Mr. Thorne, I need you to understand that at her age, with this condition, we are talking about managing comfort, not curing anything." Jacob understood. He had known this day would come eventually, had dreaded it for years, but understanding did not make it any easier. He sent word to their children, and within 2 days the cabin was full of family. Catherine held court from the bed, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, telling stories and dispensing advice and love. But every evening, despite her weakness, despite the protests of the doctor and their children, Catherine would sit up and Jacob would braid wildflowers into her hair. He used the last blooms of autumn, asters and goldenrod, the stubborn flowers that persisted even as frost threatened. "You do not have to," Catherine said one evening when they were alone. When she was so weak she could barely sit upright even with pillows supporting her. "Yes, I do," Jacob said firmly. "I have braided flowers into your hair every evening for 48 years. I'm not stopping now." "Promise me something," Catherine said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Anything. Promise me that after I am gone, you will not retreat back into that lonely man I found all those years ago. You will stay connected to our children and grandchildren. You will not shut yourself away from the world. Catherine, promise me, Jacob. I promise, he said, his voice breaking, but do not ask me to be happy about it. Do not ask me to pretend that losing you will not destroy me. You are stronger than you think, Catherine said, and you are not losing me. I will always be with you in every flower you see, in every sunset over these mountains, in the laughter of our grandchildren. I will always be here. Catherine Thorne passed away 3 days later, on a morning when the first snow of winter was falling gently outside the cabin windows. She died peacefully, surrounded by her family, with wildflowers braided into her silver hair and her hand clasped in Jacob's. The grief nearly broke him. For weeks after the funeral, Jacob moved through the cabin like a ghost, unable to work, unable to eat, barely able to speak. Their children stayed with him, taking turns making sure he was cared for, but nothing could ease the pain of losing the woman who had been his companion, his love, his whole world for nearly half a century. But he had made her a promise, and Jacob Thorne was a man who kept his promises. Slowly, painfully, but he began to rejoin the world. He started going to the forge again, not to work, but just to sit and feel the warmth. He walked to the meadow every day and looked at the wildflowers, now dormant under snow, but waiting for spring. He spent time with his grandchildren, teaching them the things Catherine would have wanted them to know, telling them stories about their grandmother and the remarkable life they had shared. And every evening, even though Catherine was no longer there to wear them, Jacob braided wildflowers into a crown and placed it on the table beside the chair where she had always sat. He used dried flowers from his stores, blooms he had preserved from the previous summer, and he braided them with the same care and attention he had always shown. Daniel found him one evening, sitting alone with a flower crown in his hands, and tears streaming down his weathered face. "Papa," Daniel said softly, sitting beside his father, "she would not want you to suffer like this." "I know," Jacob said, "but son, she was everything to me. For 48 years, she was my first thought every morning and my last thought every night. How do I exist in a world without her?" "The same way she would have existed without you," Daniel said. "By holding on to the love, by staying connected to family, by remembering that the life you built together did not end when she died. It lives on in all of us." Jacob looked at his eldest son, seeing Catherine in his eyes, in the set of his jaw, in his gentle wisdom. "When did you get so smart?" "I had good parents," Daniel said simply. Winter passed into spring, and Jacob's grief began to shift from the sharp, unbearable pain of fresh loss into something he could carry, a permanent ache that would never fully heal, but no longer paralyzed him. The wildflowers returned to the meadow in full force, and Jacob found himself able to appreciate their beauty again, though it hurt to see them without Catherine there to share the sight. He continued his ritual of braiding a flower crown every evening, placing it on Catherine's chair. His children and grandchildren understood, never questioning the practice, often joining him in the cabin to keep him company while he worked. On a warm day in early summer, nearly a year after Catherine's death, Jacob was working in the meadow when he heard voices. He looked up to find Rose approaching with her husband and their 2 youngest children, along with Daniel's eldest granddaughter, or a girl of 17 named Sarah, who reminded Jacob painfully of Catherine at that age. "Grandfather," Sarah said shyly, "Grandmother Catherine told me once that you taught her to braid flowers. Would you teach me? I want to learn so I can remember her." Jacob felt something break open in his chest, a loosening of the tight bands of grief that had constricted him for so long. "I would be honored," he said. "Come sit with me." They sat in the meadow, Jacob and his great-granddaughter, and he showed her the patterns Catherine had loved best, the techniques he had developed and refined over decades. Sarah's hands were quick and clever, and she picked up the skill with the same natural aptitude Catherine had shown all those years ago. "Tell me about her," Sarah said as they worked. "Tell me about when you fell in love." So Jacob told the story, beginning with the sound of a horse screaming and ending with Catherine's death, leaving nothing out. He told about the bandits and the wound, about the first flower crown he had made with no idea what he was doing, about Catherine's courage and strength and the way she had transformed his life completely. "That is the most beautiful story I have ever heard," Sarah said when he finished, tears running down her cheeks. "She was amazing." "She was," Jacob agreed. "But Sarah, you should know something. Your grandmother did not just transform my life. She saved it. Before her, I was just existing, hiding from the world and from myself. She taught me how to live again, how to love, how to be part of something bigger than my own pain. And that lesson did not die with her. Or do you understand?" "I think so," Sarah said. "You mean that her gift to you was not just her presence, but the ability to connect with people, to stay open to life." "Exactly. And I cannot honor her memory by shutting myself away, no matter how much I want to sometimes. I have to keep living, keep loving, keep making those connections." They finished the flower crowns together, and Sarah wore hers proudly as they walked back to the cabin where the rest of the family waited. That evening, for the first time since Catherine's death, Jacob made 2 flower crowns instead of 1. He placed Catherine's on her chair as always, but he gave the second one to Sarah, who wore it with joy and pride. It became a new tradition. Whenever family visited, Jacob would make flower crowns for anyone who wanted them, or especially the children and young women of the family. He taught them all the braiding techniques, passing on the skill that had become such an integral part of his life. The meadow became a gathering place where multiple generations would sit together, braiding flowers and talking and remembering. Jacob lived another 5 years, surrounded by family and love, maintaining the cabin and the meadow, keeping the forge warm even though he rarely worked iron anymore. He remained strong and alert, his mind sharp even as his body aged, and he never stopped his evening ritual of braiding flowers for Catherine's chair. On a peaceful morning in late summer, with wildflowers blooming in glorious profusion and the mountain air sweet and clean, Jacob Thorne passed away in his sleep in the cabin he had built with his own hands. And he was 81 years old, and he died with a faint smile on his weathered face, as if greeting an old friend. They buried him next to Catherine on a rise overlooking the meadow, under 2 tall pines that had stood sentinel for decades. The entire family gathered, children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and they covered both graves with thousands of wildflowers, braided into crowns and garlands and elaborate designs, a testament to the love that had defined Jacob and Catherine's life together. The cabin remained in the family, passed down through the generations, carefully maintained and treasured. The meadow became a protected space where wildflowers continued to bloom every summer in riotous profusion. And the tradition of braiding flowers, of taking time each day to create something beautiful and impermanent, lived on in the Thorne family, a legacy of love that stretched forward into the future. In Silver Creek, old-timers still told the story of the mountain man and the woman who had stumbled into his clearing with blood on her dress, of how he had forged iron all morning and braided wildflowers into her hair every single evening for 48 years, of a love that had transformed them both and rippled outward to touch everyone around them. It became a legend, a love story people told their children and grandchildren, a reminder that even in the harsh and unforgiving wilderness, beauty and tenderness could flourish, that the strongest hands could weave the most delicate creations, and that love, once found, could last beyond a lifetime. The mountain stood unchanged, watching over the valley as it had for millennia. And somewhere in the wind that whispered through the pines, you could almost hear the ring of hammer on iron and the sound of gentle laughter, echoes of a life well lived and a love that would never truly die. In the clearing where Jacob had built his forge and his cabin, where he had carved out a life of solitude that became a life of abundance, wildflowers continued to bloom every summer, purple and blue and red and gold, a living testament to the mountain man who had known the secret all along, that the same hands strong enough to shape unforgiving metal were also gentle enough to weave beauty into existence, and that true strength lay not in isolation, but in connection, not in walls, but in bridges, not in solitude, but in love.